Hey beautiful weirdos, and welcome back to my channel. Today I am doing a makeup and mayhem, which will be a ghostly story along with this makeup look, and I can't wait to get into it, so here we go. Ohio State Penitentiary is what we're talking about today. In Columbus in 1834, Ohio State Penitentiary was opened. It was one of the most sought after buildings in its era and location. Conditions were primitive. For that time, prisoners slept on straw mattresses, although later on beds were introduced to the cells. Food was cornbread, beans, and bacon, but it was not always that simple or that well made. Some prisoners later on said that during the Civil War times they were served pieces of meat with hair, like really long pieces of hair still attached to it, and their beans were buttered beans. It was really not good. In 1885, the penitentiary became the site for executions. Prior to this, those that were condemned to death were hung in the gallows. First, this was done publicly on the grounds. It was really made to be a spectacle. There were people that came to watch the hanging, and it was known as loud and noisy and kind of a drunken specter, really. So eventually they moved the hanging gallows to behind the grounds, where many men and women saw the last of their days. In 1897, the electric chair was brought to the prison, and it replaced the gallows. During the time of the electric chair, 315 men and women were electrocuted between 1897 and 1963, when the death penalty was finally halted in Ohio. In 1893, a prison superintendent wrote that 10,000 pages of Ohio penitentiary history would not give one idea of the inward wretchedness that of its 1,900 inmates endured. The written history is known only to God himself. During the 19th century, it was common belief that prison was more for punishment than for rehabilitation. The inmates at Ohio State Penitentiary often endured torture during their stay. There was a place known as the Hole, which was located in the basement, and prisoners would be held there in solitary. They often lost their mind or their own lives being locked in there. Disease and illness was very common in the prison, and it crept through the prison and killed many of the inmates. A cholera epidemic swept through the facility in 1849, killing 121 prisoners, and some of them were begging to be pardoned, and guards would not even come in to work. The prison was originally built to hold 1,500 people, but it was almost always overcrowded, and it was notorious for its poor conditions. At the time of the 1930 fire, which was very notorious, it was all over the papers. It's probably one of the worst fires that ever occurred. There were 4,300 prisoners at the time, which was well over the accommodations. They were actually constructing a expansion at the time, and that's where the fire started. So there was scaffolding outside of the building along one side of the prison. On that side of the building, there were 800 inmates being held at the time. And on the night of April 21st, a fire broke out on the scaffolding. It's believed to have been a small spark fire on some oiled rags, and that's where it started. There's controversy. They believe that some believe that the prisoners started it in an attempt to escape, but it was mainly believed that the fire started due to the horrible conditions and lack of cleanup. So there were 800 prisoners being housed in that area, and that night many of them had already been locked in for the night, although the guards were still putting prisoners in their cells. When the fire started and smoke began filling the cells, the inmates were begging to be let out. Many reports claim that the guards not only refused to open the cells, but they continued to lock prisoners in. And meanwhile, the fire continued to spread and build, and it eventually reached the roof of the prison, where it endangered many of the inmates that were up on those higher levels. So finally, 2 inmates overtook a guard and were able to get hold of the keys. They attempted to start releasing inmates. Unfortunately, only about 50 inmates were able to be released before the fire overtook. And the heavy smoke stopped them from releasing more inmates. The roof caved in on those upper levels, and about 160 prisoners burned to death. It was really tragic. Some guards did work to save the lives of their charges. Unfortunately, due to the other guards' behavior and unwillingness to help, a riot broke out. Initially, firefighters were unable to access the fire, and because of that, the fire was left uncontrolled. By the time the firefighters were able to control the fire, 320 people were dead, and 130 were seriously injured. Many lives were lost in this, and so much could have been prevented to just stop the whole thing. During its operation, it housed several known inmates, including General John Morgan, who notoriously escaped during the Civil War, and Bugs Moran, who was a well-known American gangster. His gang was involved in the Valentine's Day massacre. His gang members were some of the lives lost. I believe one of his gangsters actually survived, but 6 of them died. He was not there because he decided to sleep in that day. As well as O. Henry, who was an author, Chester Himes, and Sam Shepard, whose story inspired the movie The Fugitive, which is really well known. Sam Shepard was actually exonerated later on in 1966 of murdering his wife, and he went on to continue his medical career. One other person worth mentioning, and I'm going to cover a little bit of his story because it needs to be told, is a notable inmate by the name of Lester Eubanks. He is actually listed on the 15 most wanted list, and he needs to be found. Lester Eubanks is wanted for escaping the prison while on a temporary furlough to go shopping in town in December of 1973. Lester was serving time for the murder of a 14-year-old girl by the name of Mary. His story was actually featured on America's Most Wanted. So this may sound familiar to some of you because this was recently aired. On November 14th, 1969, Mary and her sister were at the laundromat doing laundry when they ran out of change. So rather than run to their grandmother's house, she decided to just run up the road to another laundromat and get more change. While she was out, she came across Lester Eubanks. Lester Eubanks shot her twice and then beat her with a brick when she resisted his sexual advances. When she did not return to her sister after a few hours, her sister reported that she was missing. They later found Mary Ellen dead, laying on the street from her injuries. Eubanks was brought in for questioning and he confessed to killing her. He was sentenced to death, but when the death penalty was changed, he was sentenced to life in 1972. Eubanks became an honor inmate and he was awarded a shopping trip into town. The prisoners were allowed several hours of shopping time by themselves to purchase items for family members and friends during Christmas. when their time was up, they were supposed to report back to the guards for pickup. Of course, Eubanks did not return when the other inmates did. He used that time to slip away. And he has never been found. At the time Eubanks slipped away, he was 5'11" and weighed 175 pounds. He has black hair and brown eyes. He has a large scar or burn on his right arm, on the upper right arm. His birthday is October 31st, 1943. He would be in his 60s. He was thought to have fled to Michigan and may have also spent some time in LA. Since airing the Unsolved Mysteries on his case, they do believe that they have a lead on where Eubanks is. But continue to share the information and get the word out about him, because he needs to be caught. It is long overdue that her family receive justice for him. If prisons are truly haunted for the death and tragedy that has taken place in them, then Ohio Penitentiary is most likely one of the most haunted. Some of the reported hauntings and areas of paranormal activity are the administration wing, where visitors and employees have reported experiencing strong paranormal events. This is where one of the warden's wives that lived there at the time resided in that area. She suffered a fatal bullet wound from a gun that accidentally fell off of a shelf in their closet. Some have claimed that they smell her perfume, or the scent of a rose perfume, coming from her particular bathroom of that area. Others have also reportedly said that they felt a rush of cold air pass through them as they walked through the area. It's also not uncommon to hear of a jammed camera shutter when they are in that area, and then as they leave the area, it works again. It's also been said that down in the basement, the spirit of a 14-year-old, I know, so young, he was beaten to death in the basement, and it's been said that his spirit has been spotted lingering among the decaying basement. It's so sad. So sad. Also spotted is a guard who gives off a really sinister vibe. Like, no thanks. The library is another hot spot. Psychics that have visited the library have reported seeing a ghost or spirit of a young woman, possibly Helen, but we don't really know for sure, or a nurse who was killed by one of the prisoners. There is also a graveyard on the grounds that is home to about 210 prisoners. I'm not sure why all the prisoners weren't buried there. Maybe some were sent home to their families. I'm not sure. But visitors have reported Visitors have reported seeing objects move in the graveyard. And a lot of equipment failure is common in the inmates' graveyard. The chapel is also the scene of many paranormal events. Many believe it's a nucleus for much of the prison's haunting and ghost tales. Supposedly, before the area became the chapel, it was used for executions. People have said to have caught a lot of orbs on pictures. They've also described capturing unusual and strange sounds coming from inside the chapel. And then there is also the infirmary, where many prisoners died miserable deaths. It's been said that sick and dying inmates were left there without care. Many who starved to death because they were way too weak to fight off thieves who were taking their food. So this area is known in paranormal circles to set off EMF detectors. And many have claimed to capture clusters of orbs. Most likely those of the sick patients. An unexplained gust of air passing by you is also being reported by visitors. When prisoners were still being housed there, they also said to have felt a woman placing a blanket on them, almost in a caring way or in a comforting way. Also mentioned in the hole is a lot of reports of sudden nausea, fever-like chills, and the uncomfortable feeling of being watched. The east wing on the first floor has reported shadow people. And the third floor, middle admin, also has reports of shadow people, footsteps, and audible voices. The sub-basement is said to be very uncomfortable. A lot of people avoid going there because of the feeling. Some people have had ghostly grabs in the area. Obviously, a lot of doors slamming and aggressive things are happening at the prison. Some people have even claimed when you're standing on the grounds that you can hear the crackle of fire and the screams from inside from the night of the fire. So that concludes the story of the Ohio State Penitentiary. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did, and I look forward to doing another Makeup and Mayhem video next week.